Welcome to a special panel for the Georgetown University Wargaming Society. Today, we have a panel on the military exercises and wargaming and professional military education. This is a panel that features authors from the recently published special wargaming issue of the Scandinavian Journal of Military Studies. We have many of its authors here joining us today, and today we'll be talking about how wargaming and military exercises fit within professional military education, or PME. So today we're going to jump right in and ask our questions from the editor and also the authors of the volume. So Karsten, do you want to quickly introduce yourself briefly, and then we'll jump right into questions?
Yes, thank you very much, Sebastian, and thank you for organizing this event. My name is Karsten Rønfeldt. I'm a professor at the Norwegian Defence University College in Oslo, and the editor of the special issue that we are discussing today.
Perfect, Carson. So the first question I have for you is, you as the editor of the special issue we're talking about today, what is the idea or core concept behind it?
Wargaming and exercises have been used at military academies across the world for centuries, and so at the Norwegian Defence University College. So we use them, as all of the other military academies, to improve the competence of our students to become military officers. And you said once that the global wargaming community is like disparate islands of excellence. And this is also the case in Norway, between the 8 different departments in the university college, but also within each department. So some of us got together and said, why don't we share experiences and learn together to become better teachers, to use the potentials of war games and exercises in better ways. And why don't we invite some people from the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment, like Vorin Alme and Robert Friedheim, who is with us today? And why don't we invite some international experts like yourself and Tom Watt, who is with us today, and Peter Perla, who is with us today, and learn from them? So that was a basic idea. So we organized, we had some 25 of us all together. So we organized a conference in Bergen in May with some 80 participants, all from military academies in NATO, and also some from the civilian sector who use war games and exercises in their educations, medical schools, law schools. And so we had 2 days where we talked about the issues, where we played games. And then we wrote this special issue that is now out, where there are 12 articles and I don't know, some 20 plus authors to the articles. Yeah, we did this just to learn together, to become better, to get better officers.
That's great. So you mentioned over 12 articles and 20 authors. Can you provide the audience who have not seen or read the articles what kind of topics you address over this special issue?
Yeah, so there's a variety of topics. There are some at strategic level, there are some at tactical level. There are some with general experiences from Peter Perla and Tom Watt about the pitfalls, the potentials, and the utilities of war games. And there's some about military exercises. What are the experiences there? How can we organize good exercises? And there are some about games. I have one article with 2 of my colleagues. We write about matrix games, and we discuss how we use that to develop strategic mindsets among our cadets. But there are many different topics that we are going to discuss, and we have with us in the panel today the authors, or several of the authors with us. So I'm looking forward to hearing how they present their arguments.
Perfect, thank you. So we'll be slowly going around our panel and having everyone sort of briefly talk about their issue or their chapter in the special issue. So next up is one who needs probably no introduction, which is Peter Perla. Peter, you want to introduce yourself pretty briefly for those who do not know who you are and why you're so important. Peter, I think you're unmuted, muted, so I will unmute you for you. There you go.
I'm good. Yes, my main claim to wargaming fame comes from a book that I wrote about 100 years ago called The Art of Wargaming. And since that time, I've been involved in designing and analyzing and critiquing war games for the Center for Naval Analyses, where I am essentially retired at this point, but still keeping my fingers into the pie. Do you want me to talk about the article at all now, or?
Yeah. So 1 second. So so you write, one of your claims to fame is your famed cycle of research and education. Why is that so important in not only wargaming, but also in the wider literature of understanding how wargaming fits?
Sure. Okay. So when I was doing the research for the book, I began to see that the times that wargaming was most effective in providing professional military education in particular was when it was integrated with analyses and exercises and real world experience. And so I decided that based on my research that wargaming and the cycle of research is really fundamental to both research and education. War games, practical experience, exercises, historical documentation, we have to integrate all of them if we're going to learn and teach the full extent of what we can about current and future military activities. If you think about it, analysis and data inform us about the physical world. War games help create a synthetic experience of making difficult decisions under time pressure and uncertainty. And of course, real world activity and the documentation of past experience shows us how theory is actually applied and works in the real world. And so if only by integrating all of those elements, using each of those tools for what they're best at, can learners develop their understanding and practice their profession effectively. So that's why I think wargaming, the cycle of research is important, not only for analysis and research, but also for education.
So Peter, what is the central role of wargaming in this cycle that you mentioned?
Well, okay, so war games focus on decision making, right? And if you look at the research that Dietrich Dörner from Germany has conducted, he argues that human beings are not built to make effective decisions in complex situations plagued by uncertainty and especially under time pressure. In order to perform better in those circumstances, learners have to make better decisions by practicing making all kinds of decisions under different circumstances. But it's also important not only to practice, but to do thoughtful reflection on how it is you approach the decision-making problem. How do you integrate your experiences in the way you make decisions? And so the integration of experience in playing a game gives players the opportunity to assess just how they made the decisions. Not only did they make good decisions, but how did they make the decisions? And that way they can begin to develop mental muscle memory, which William McCarty Little of the U.S. Naval War College identified as the key, because it allows you to make the right decision, rightly applied in time, which is the hallmark of success in war, as in any human endeavor. So that's why wargaming is critical as sort of the linchpin between the physics of analysis and the experience of actual execution of activities and exercises in the real world.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Peter. So next on our list is Tom. Tom, you want to briefly introduce yourself for the rest of the audience?
Hello, everyone. I'm Tom Moa. I'm the head of the UK Defence Modelling and Simulation School, which sounds incredibly impressive and implies having manpower, resources, and money. None of which I have. There's only me, but they've changed my title to head, which sounds good. So my job is to supervise the courses run at the UK Defence Academy, teaching people about computer simulation. That's about half my job. And the other half of my job is internal to MOD consulting, really, on simulation, which in the old days used to do with computer simulation. But now that we realize that you can destabilize a Western democracy with a few Facebook advertisements, people are kind of thinking that some of the computer models really aren't helpful. And they want to learn how to think, exactly as Peter said about decision making. So I end up talking about wargaming, which has been very interesting. It's taken me all over the world. I'd like to apologize because I'm recovering from COVID. So if I suddenly burst into a fit of coughing, that's because I'm not completely recovered. And if you hear a dog barking in the background, that's my wire hair fox terrier going bananas at the chickens. So I apologize for that. But that's me. Yes.
Thank you, Tom. As always, you're always great to have on the webinar. So I will ask you one of the most controversial questions in wargaming, which is, what is a wargaming and why is it so difficult to define?
Yeah. What is a wargame? Yeah. I mean, the only person brave enough to try to define it is Peter, and I'll leave definitions to him. I really don't care. I absolutely do not care what the definition of a wargame is. The only thing that interests me in uniform, still serving, is it useful? And the difficulty is there are lots of different communities involved in wargaming. There are those who want to do education. There are those who are trying to do training, and there are those who are trying to do analysis. And all of those organizations have to work together in the cycle of research, as Peter pointed out, in order to get those intelligent questions together, work out what we want to do, come up with some numbers to persuade the politicians to give us some money, otherwise we're never going to buy anything. And those different communities, in many cases, have completely different ideas about what wargaming is and how it works. And in a lot of cases, regard the alternatives as something lesser or nothing to do with real wargaming, which can be very divisive and ultimately harmful. Now, from my point of view, I'm interested in education. So if I put a perfect definition on the screen for my students, they're going to look at it and they're going to shrug and go, okay. Whereas if I put something up that's not right, it's not perfect, it's obviously got some mistakes, and I point out to the students that it isn't right or perfect, and ask them if they could come up with some suggestions, then immediately you get a Socratic dialogue taking place and learning happens. Now, of course, that's fine for education. You know, the game doesn't even have to work so long as you can get that proper Socratic dialogue. But if you're training, then it's essential that you're going to get the procedures to work together so that those decisions that are so important can be made correctly. And of course, if you're dealing with analysis, you're going to have to persuade people in the treasury to give you money. And to do that, you're going to need numbers, and you're going to have a rigorous process. All of these are completely different, which is why having a single grand all-purpose encompassing definition is ultimately useless and pretty dangerous. Is it useful? If it's useful, that's great.
Hey, great, Tom. So following up that question of when you mentioned sort of the large bins of education and analytical gaming and all the other applications of wargaming, in your own experience in your career, what do you think has been the most useful application of wargaming, whether that's a specific instance or a broad category of wargaming that has been useful?
Well, I mean, there are very there are a number of reasons why you'd want to do wargaming, and understanding system capabilities, efficient situational understanding. Playing a game gets you up to speed incredibly quickly. Education, training, current force strategy, future force development, part of the military decision-making process, predicting possible futures and all of that. Those are all really important. Singling one out is difficult, but I would like to go with Tom Schelling, who did wargaming with President Kennedy and the White House, and ultimately his view on wargaming helped shape the way things are done. And his reasons was that he thought the most important thing was working with people that you may have to rely on in a crisis, getting to know them, getting to understand them, and in that environment, in that context, practicing making decisions so that you know the person who's going to take risks. You're going to know the person who always wants a bit more data, and you will understand that. So I was persuaded how important that was during the big cyber attack that happened in Estonia quite a few years ago now. And Estonia deliberately was trying to be as interconnected as possible. And they used to have a dinner once a month where all of the tech-savvy entrepreneurs would get together. They'd have talks, they'd have presentations and things. So they all knew each other. So when the big crisis came for a cyber, they had each other's phone numbers, and they knew how to get on with it. So when we're talking about military organizations and military problems, it's exactly the same thing. It's getting to know people. So there are all sorts of other reasons why you might want to do it. But I think Tom Schelling's reason is probably the most compelling. And since he got a Nobel Prize for it, I'm not going to argue with that.
Perfect. So following up with another broad and sort of wide-ranging question is, what is one of the biggest challenges you have encountered in implementing, applying, and using wargaming in your career?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest problem is that people think if I get a bigger computer and I can have more data, I'm somehow going to get the answer and I'm going to win, which is insane and frankly extremely difficult. And there will be people here who go, oh, well, yes, but, you know, AI, machine learning, all this stuff, eventually we're going to get the answer. And we're not. We're absolutely not going to get the answer. We might be able to rule out some of the more obviously stupid ideas, but we're never going to get the answer. And one of the things about AI is there are all sorts of problems that are amenable to being optimized, studied, whatever, using AI. And that's fantastic. Yeah, they definitely are. But the military are going to get those for free because they're in the area where ideas can be optimized for AI solutions, like logistics, just in time, that sort of thing. Route analysis, pattern matching, stuff like that. The thing is, of course, if we put a contract out, then companies that are supported by AI are going to be more competitive. So we're going to get those AI advantages for free. But what excites a lot of senior officers is the idea of human decision-making being supported by AI and having human behavior modeling works out. Well, this is utterly insane because, you know, I can't predict what my wife's going to do this evening, let alone predict what the population is going to do. And when you have a country invading the Ukraine, for example, quite convinced that the Ukrainians will give up immediately, you can find out just how badly wrong you can be. So I think one of the biggest dangers of wargaming is that people think that a computer is going to solve what is essentially a contest of wills between people. computers are all very well at measuring things, but they don't tell you what goes on in the minds and hearts of real people. And it's only when you get real people challenging real people in that adversarial advantage, adversarial circumstances that a war game is, only then do you get those insights that are going to help you going forward. So I have changed my opinion a little bit in that, yes, a little bit of AI is going to help you in certain areas and stop you being quite so stupid, but it's never going to solve your problems for you. So there I am, not sitting on the fence on this one. Okay, back to you, Sebastian.
Hey, absolutely great. Thank you, Tom. So we'll move on to our next panelist. Anne, you want to quickly introduce yourself for the rest of the audience?
Hi, I'm Anne-Marie. I am Associate Professor in English at the Norwegian Defence University College. And my interest in wargaming is from a languages and literatures perspective. So what I've, should I carry on or should you ask me the questions or?
Yeah, no, fantastic. So your article uses a narrative approach to studying matrix games, which is a style of game design. What does that involve from your perspective in your article?
For this, what I zeroed in on for this project concerned how games and exercises work in military education. And that was, so my starting point was that seeming contradiction that these narrative elements of matrix games, the game scenario, the unfolding narrative arc, are typically regarded as crucial for the game's effectiveness as a learning activity, in that the story element contributes to both immersion and verisimilitude, but at the same time, these characteristics are sometimes identified as a cause for concern as well. Immersion in a character or narrative scenario has been flagged as potentially diminishing the learning effect of games because immersion is seen to work in opposition to reflection. So I also was interested in discovering how the cadets playing this particular language, this matrix game, orientated themselves to the narrative elements. So I analyzed the game interaction, the situated language use, I was guided by an understanding that narrative is a rhetorical activity. It is has rhetorical functions. So I started from positioning theory, added some bits from rhetorical narratology, and essentially combined two models on how people, audiences, players relate to different levels or aspects of narrative to see how narratives rhetorically functioned in this game.
So you mentioned rhetorical functions and narratives. So how can drawing attention to those in games expand our understanding of how matrix games provide educational value?
Well, first, it was interesting for me to note that narrative is present in more ways than perhaps typically is focused on in matrix game studies, the sort of subtle ways that the players use narratives as elements of their argumentation and rhetorical positioning. That you have the formal moves where they presented the pro arguments that was meant to indicate whether or not the action was plausible. But they also used plot creation and character reactions as sort of implicit warrants in their argumentation. So that came in addition to the formal arguments and sometimes substituted for them as well. Secondly, I would say that it's made me more aware of how players orientate themselves to the unfolding narrative in that they shift between its participatory frameworks. It was noticeable when they spoke from the perspective of the character or role they were embodying, and when they shifted back and forth between that and the gaming situation, where they sort of interacted with each other as cadets and as future military professionals. And this occurred spontaneously during game time. So there's more work to be done here for sure, but the implications, I think, are interesting in that obviously this in no way negates the need for an after-action debrief or reflection period at the end of the game as well. The post-game reflection is obvious and necessary, but for sort of conscious and extended reflection, where sort of where a lot of the learning occurs. But for instructors, perhaps it's interesting to note these sort of micro reflections that go on during game time. And the third lesson is attention to how the medium of the game affects the game as well. The game I observed and analyzed was played via Microsoft Teams. This was during the height of COVID, so precautions were in place. And that enabled some reactions in the, for example, use of props to actually substitute for the player in the video at times, which made it difficult for others to engage with that player. The use of emojis to react to statements, but again, difficult to gauge for the players and for me observing as well who that person was. Was it the player? Was it the character that sort of was behind this particular utterance? So obvious perhaps, but the material format of the game influences the game strongly, and I found that really interesting and would like to do more on that.
So thank you, Anne. So we may circle back to some of your notions of like how rhetoric and narrative functions work in games. So next is, first, I will apologize for some of the horrible butchering of names I will do on this panel. So Howard, you want to say your name and introduce yourself quickly for our panel?
Sure. My name is Håvard Fridheim. I'm with the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment, a place where I've been since 1996. And I've been doing war games ever since 1998, or at least I thought there were war games until I started reading definitions, when I found out that there were really scenario-based discussions or exercises or what have you. Eventually, I sort of migrated towards the view that Tom Wood presented earlier. I don't really care what you call them as long as you know what you do with them and what you're trying to achieve. And that's where we are now.
Great. So your paper examines or provides really 8 practical lessons for planning and conducting war games, primarily used on your own wargaming experiences over the years. So why did you write this paper and for whom?
Well, the obvious answer is that Carson wanted to write something for this special issue. But beyond that, there are two reasons, really. There's an in-house reason and there's a more external oriented reason. The in-house is that we wanted to improve our approaches to gaming and all the game-like activities we run. We run a lot of games and exercises and discussions over the years. And as good researchers, we always wrote diligently the lessons learned reports, examining what worked, what didn't work, what could have been better. And then we hid all those reports into folders that no one had access to. And we didn't bother to look at them ourselves either. And eventually we didn't really learn anything from all the games we ran. But we had this huge empirical bank, really, of findings from past games and exercises. And it seemed a bit silly not to try to look into them, to analyze them, to try find out what could it benefit from improving, what works, what doesn't. So 5 or 6 years ago, we started looking into the reports, structure the lessons, and see what we could learn from them. And the sad part we found is that we kept repeating the same mistakes over and over, time and time again. And that's why we felt the need to start documenting some of the recurring issues and try to share them at least in-house so others could benefit from them as well. So this paper is more of an updated extract of some of the things we have found over the years. So that was the in-house reason. And on the more external side is that, well, from 2015 onwards, we've heard all about this resurgence or revitalization of wargaming that's found place in the US and across NATO countries and elsewhere. However, I don't think that Norway really has seen the same significant change in the ways we think about wargaming and our approaches to the technique, at least not until quite recently. So we're a small country. The different communities are small. There are local pockets that rarely interact with each other. And I figured a good way to at least allow us to start taking part in the resurgence ourselves and all the fun happening elsewhere is to try to start sharing experiences, at least nationally, to, well, our different approaches to gaming, what we find that works, what we find that doesn't. And this paper seemed like a good opportunity to do so. So that's the reasons. And well, the audience is both in-house at FFI, the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment, but also externally within Norway and elsewhere.
Fantastic. So one of the lessons that caught my eye from your paper is really don't spend all your hours on the scenario. And for many of us analysts and researchers, that may seem counterintuitive, right? So why is this lesson in particular something that you happen upon in your own war games, but also in your experience in those AARs that you mentioned?
Yeah, it happens all the time. So we really felt the need to highlight that issue. But first, I might address the term scenario, at least the way we use it. We use it as a wide term. It describes the background of the crisis we cover in the games, the actual crisis that is played out, and any vignettes or injects that describe the challenges in more detail. So it's a complete story that we prepare for the game, at least before the players enter the mix and start making decisions and shape the outcomes of the story. So that's the scenario. And why should you not spend all your hours on it? One thing we see is that many wargamers, researchers, military staff tend to think that the scenario is the game, or at least one of the main deliverables from the game. So they jump deep into the story part, story writing, start writing an exciting story, seemingly to get an outlet for all the creativity they burn in their daily lives. And that's when you start getting the danger of a narrative drift, when the scenario writing takes a life of its own. Story elements are piled into the scenario, whether it's fit for purpose or not, whether they address the goals of the game or not. And so the effort explodes and you end up with a scenario that's not necessarily fit for purpose or what you're trying to do. So we often find that it's easier to fill the positions in the scenario team. It's no issue at all to get people to join the fray and toss scenario ideas around. The initial planning meetings are often all about the scenario. But what is a challenge is to sort of shape all this creativity into something useful that fits the purpose of the game. And at least in my experience, you really know to know where you're headed before you start writing the story and the scenario. If not, all those fun storylines will just be that. It's fun, but not necessarily useful for the game you're trying to run.
On that note, if you had to pick one of your 8 lessons that you write about in your paper, which one do you think is the most important, or the one that people should keep in mind the most as they conduct war games in their units or in PME?
Well, it's perhaps both surprising and perhaps not. It ought to be a simple lesson, and yet we often fail on it anyway in practice. But it's the first lesson I write about in the article. You need to know the aim of the game. You need to know what you're trying to do before you start designing it. Why are you running this game? What is it you're trying to achieve? What do you need results for? What activities or decisions are you about to support? Understanding that is really critical before going forward and start designing the game. We often fail on this ourselves. But we also often run games for external customers or stakeholders in the ministries or in industry. And, well, they want us to run a game. Okay, great. Why do you want a game? And surprisingly often, they don't really have a good answer to that. It's been 10 years since the last one. We've heard about this thing called wargaming. You want to try it. It's some of the things we often meet. So that's when we really need to engage with them and try to understand what is it that they need? What are their outcomes they're looking for? What are their expectations for what a game can give them? Is it really a game they need, or is it an exercise? Is it a scenario-based discussion, or for that matter, a seminar with briefs? Could also cover their needs. So an example, if they want to test in-house security procedures for the staff, you don't really need a 2-hour seminar plenary game with strategic leadership. And that's close to a real life example we've had. So it might sound trivial, but the initial problem structuring is where we find we need to put in the efforts. Manage expectations, know what you're trying to achieve. That makes your game design process far more efficient. So aim, then game.
Thank you. We may circle back to some of your topics later on, but next is Voren. Would you like to introduce yourself for the audience in our panel?
Sure, even though your pronunciation was perfect. So appreciate that. My name is Voren Alme. I work at the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment with Håvard. And I've written an article for this special issue with Associate Professor Adeline Hvitsten.
Perfect. So how do you use wargames in your research?
Yes, well, I use them primarily for educational purposes, and I'm a political scientist, so I often use wargames to teach introductory courses to international politics or security politics, like diplomatic simulations, like negotiations or Senate hearings or so on. And over the last few years, I've been really interested in what really makes a wargame work. So how to best conduct and implement this wargame into the general course, and how to connect the wargame to the general course outcomes and the syllabus and so on. So in addition to conducting educational wargames, I've also been trying to conduct as many interviews as possible with both students that have been part of our wargames, but also with designers, with educators who have had the experience of seeing their class through an educational wargame. And I've tried to just pinpoint from game to game and from interview to interview what made this particular wargame work.
Fantastic. So from your experience leading wargames in the classroom, what do you find the most rewarding about using games as learning tools?
Yes, so in my experience, there are certain things that are hard to teach just theoretically, and as this special issue of course shows, some things are really best taught in somewhat of an experience learning based format, where wargames can be really beneficial. And in our article, we draw from our experience. We find that conventional wisdom often tells us that there are some challenges in wargaming, especially in the educational wargames, that need to be mitigated. And well, it is we contend at least that some of them aren't even really challenges. They can be quite to the contrary, pivot points for learning, and that the main challenge in an educational wargame is switching from what we call an experience mode during the wargame and into an observer mode during the debrief. And that it is really this switch, this consecutive switch from being really immersed in the game during the game, and then switching to the role of an analyst, where you stop playing the game and you accept what's happened and then enter into more of an observer role.
Great. So what are some challenges you have encountered using wargames in the classroom?
Yes, so our experience is that if students aren't in the right mode at the right time, then really you don't reach the learning potential of your game. And that experience of seeing students not really taking the game seriously enough to really immerse themselves being uncertain, for instance, being uncertain as to whether the other students are really immersed, not wanting to make a fool out of yourself, and so on. So not really being in the experience mode that we call it. That is a challenge. And conversely, the challenge of getting students out again of that immersion, where you accept what's happened, but you also step out of trying to change outcomes, and you treat the whole game more like a case study, really, something that's happened and that you can compare to previous games that other students have played. That is really important.
So something you mentioned earlier, which is about the switching of modes in educational gaming, is can you tell us a little bit more how you ended up focusing on that switching or transitioning of modes in players in educational gaming?
Yes, so we try to come up with a list of different techniques that might facilitate this switch, and that is both getting the students immersed, getting them into the right mode during game time, but also switching into this analyst role. So we have this list of different techniques, different tactics, and they range from everything from introducing deliverables into the game, having an extended debrief at the end, maybe even a deliverable after the game has ended. We have these different things that we got from interviews and also from our own experience. But one example that follows as an implication from our proposal is that it is really difficult actually to get students into the right mode at the right time, and that therefore you should only really do it once between game and debrief. And that if true, that would mean that we suggest not doing during action reviews, for instance, because that would suggest that you can easily move in and out of experience mode and observer mode, where you do something and then you immediately analyze what's happened and why. And we suggest that you should stay in this immersion, this immersed role of trying to experience as fully as possible, and then enter into the observer mode and do it like finally only once. So our suggestion is keeping it to an after action review.
Perfect. So another question that I wanted to ask are, what are some of the implications of your research for designing and conducting war games, considering these modes and other things you mentioned in your article?
Sure. So besides not doing this during action reviews, we also have different suggestions about introducing deliverables that might make it easier for students to step into the observer role. And that might be as simple as extending the debrief to a mandatory exam, for instance, an oral exam or a written exam where you use theory from the syllabus to analyze what happened in the game, and really then conduct a case study using case study methodology to analyze what happens, and then you really take the step into the observer role, where you treat yourself and your fellow students as a case. So that might work. We also experienced from our interviews also that getting the students initially into the experience mode, it might help to make the game mandatory, a mandatory activity. Because one professor we interviewed, she experienced that when the game was just something you could choose, then many students didn't see it as serious enough to prioritize. She experienced that students were saying, no, sorry, I can't, I have to go to the library and actually study. And they didn't see this as beneficial to their actual learning. So they didn't take it seriously enough to enter into this experience mode. So just actually showing up was something that she needed to design to get them to take it seriously. But also, like Håvard talked about, the scenario text is something that might actually get the students to take the whole thing seriously, where they see connections to the real world. That might help. So everything that might get the students to take it seriously and that might make it fun for them, could help.
So I actually have a question straight directed at you that I want to address really quickly before we move on is, do you switch students' roles as part of the game organization, like is it planned, or has it been a method that we have success with in terms of switching roles in second and third iterations of a game? For example, you play one country in one iteration and play another country as another. Does that mean the games have any different kind of impact, or why should you be doing this, or why you shouldn't be doing this?
Mm-hmm. That is a very interesting question. I've never done that before. I've never had students switch into others' roles, but I can see why you would ask it, because it's a very, I would presume that it's a very instructive way of actually getting students to enter into the observer mode after they've made decisions and try to see things from the other person's viewpoint. Is that what you're getting at?
I think that's a part of it. Also, I think also in some parts of matrix gaming is like one of the things that you have to do is adjudicate why, from your perspective, something works, but also sometimes some games require you to switch roles, right? Like Rand's Hegemony requires you to switch roles while playing from being an intel officer to being the adversary, which is sometimes hard for players as they try to switch those roles.
So my initial thought is that that is really interesting, and I should have introduced it into my article, that thought. But I would also be cautious just as far as switching too often goes. So I would perhaps have waited to do the switch until after the game was over.
That's great. Thank you. So our next person is, I believe I'm pronouncing the name right, is Mas. Can you introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'm not, something prevents me from starting my camera, but I don't think my face is that important. I'm a professor of cybersecurity, and I work in 2 different places. I work at Inland Norway University of Applied Sciences, where we have a small group that do education in preparedness and crisis management. And I work at the Cyber Academy of the Norwegian Defence University College. So, and in both places we do exercises. In Inland Norway, we do decision-making training with personnel from preparedness organizations, while at the Cyber Academy, I make cyber defense exercises for IT engineering cadets for the Norwegian Armed Forces. But they are quite different roles.
Perfect. So the first question I have for you is, how do you see the connection or relationship between cyber defense exercises and the field of wargaming writ large?
So that's something I'm very eager to investigate, because as I said, I work in these 2 places where we both do different kind of exercises, and there are different roles. And I think the reason is that cyber defense exercises is something that it seems to me, have grown kind of bottom up from cybersecurity, from the cybersecurity community, and is very much focused on making very realistic technical exercises where the participants can train their technical skills, while decision-making training is, I believe, is at least seems to me to be much closer to what we call wargaming. And there seems to be very little relation, very little contact between these 2 kind of communities. And I'm very curious about why.
So the next question I have to ask is, what are some of the important trends and challenges for cyber defense exercises in the future from your perspective?
Yeah, so it seems that well, the challenge with cyber defense exercises is that they, in the community, they seem to want to do decision-making training as well, and then they put this on top of cyber defense exercises. But cyber defense exercises are huge enterprises, because you need to build. You want it to be realistic. You need to build a realistic infrastructure where you can do proper cyber attacks, so that the participants can do proper cyber defense. And then when you try to build decision making. On top of that, you get really huge, heavy exercises, which are not really scalable. Because when you try to scale, when you try to have more participants, then you also need to expand the infrastructure. You need more people to do the cyber attacks that the cyber defenders can work on, and so forth. So there's a trend that the exercises are really growing in size, but I think they're not really scalable.
Perfect. So actually, before we move on to the next question, for those who are unfamiliar about what you mean by cyber defense exercises, can you spend a little bit of time expanding on what those practically look like?
Well, typically you will train incident response teams. So the people doing practical cyber defense, these are analysts who will try to detect cyber attacks, to analyze them, and to specify mitigations. And to do this, you build an infrastructure. You build in practice. You will build computer networks. And then you will have a red team, a group of people, usually trained penetration testers, that will carry out cyber attacks on this infrastructure. And then it's up to the defenders to detect attacks, to analyze, figure out what is happening, and propose mitigations.
Perfect. So my last question for you before we move on is, how can, or what can the cyber defense, cyber security community and the wargaming community learn from each other, right? What are some lessons learned from one community that we can apply to the other, and so forth?
Yeah, so I come from the cybersecurity community, and I see that the wargaming community probably has something valuable to offer, because, as I said, we have this real challenge of scalability, and I think we need to learn how to do proper tabletops, proper decision making training and exercises without dragging along this huge infrastructure that we always insist on having. On the other side, when I observe the other world, as I said, where we do training of personnel in prepared organizations, we have very little. I see very little cyber-related scenarios. So I think that this community has something to learn with integrating the cyber incidents in their scenarios.
Fantastic. So our next and our last panelist for the day, before we go back around the table again, is Ken. Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, hello. My name is Kjetil Enstad, and I apologize for my terribly difficult name. It's Old Norse, and it means helmet or kettle. So in fact, it's the same word as the English kettle. It's the same root. It's Old Norse, both of them. So you can call me Kettle as well. I'm an associate professor at the Norwegian Defence University College. Currently, I'm working with the MOD. That's what I'm doing in 2022. But I'll be going back to the academy, the military academy, after Christmas.
So my first question to you is, in your paper / article, you link gaming really closely with learning. Could you explain how you established that link in your paper?
Yeah. Let me first of all acknowledge that this is not very radical to link wargaming to learning. I don't have the same amount of experience with wargaming as a lot of the party here present. So I approached the question of contributing to this special issue by starting from my interest in the nature of knowledge in a professional context, and also how that knowledge is developed through education. I introduce Ludwig Wittgenstein, a German philosopher, and his ideas of learning. And he starts, and I think Tom will be very pleased to hear that, by discussing the nature of a game. And he says that there is no one characteristic or one set of characteristics that will encompass all games. So there is no definition of games. What a game means is wholly dependent on the situation where the game is played. And he says that that is true for all of language. The precise meaning of a word emerges from the situation where it's used. So a meaning of a word is its use, is one of his most famous phrases. And he calls that a language game. And he says the reason why language functions is because between one situation where a word or a game is used and the next, there is something he calls family resemblances. So there is no one characteristic for all situations. There is a family resemblance from one situation to the next. So to Wittgenstein, every kind of meaningful interaction is a game or a language game. In my opinion, this has two important implications for wargaming. First, it means that we understand when we receive or learn what is called propositional knowledge, knowledge in books, and which we often use to test what we learn from wargaming. That is also part of the language game, and thus does not have necessarily a more privileged position. This is not part of the article, and the argument is rather long, so it will have to be developed later. But second, learning is always, in a sense, gaming, and so learning through wargaming is not fundamentally different from learning in other situations. There are superficial differences, of course. A game needs some props, some dice, or playing cards, or whatever. But in terms of how we learn to make sense of the world around us through language, it's not fundamentally different. We cannot, in other words, completely isolate wargaming as a separate realm from other kinds of learning and look at it from the outside, as it were. So learning happens regardless. Looking at wargaming through the lens of Wittgenstein, as it were, I argue that wargaming is just one game in a complex web of games that constitute all our learning. So, yeah.
So that's great. So in your conclusion of your article, you seem to warn against the potential hazard of using wargaming for educational purposes. Could you expand on this little bit of warning and hazard that you mentioned?
Yeah, so this is something I would really like to have some responses to or input, because I'm not entirely convinced of my own argument, but I'm leaning towards this argument. So, but I can be corrected. The hazard I see has to do with the concept of family resemblances. So you develop a repertoire of instances of certain situations through participating in language game or in war games, so this is something that an author called Shatsky has developed on the basis of Wittgenstein. He says that when you have this repertoire, you tend to understand things in certain ways. So a soldier will develop his or her repertoire of, call it memories, call it experiences, experiences from reading books, experiences from wargaming. And when faced with a real world situation, a specific situation, those memories or experiences that you have will shape your understanding of that situation. And war games always, I would say, hazard to say always, have some limitations. Maybe limited the amount of actors, the playing rules may be very strict. The background information to the scenario may be very limited, and so on and so forth. And I think by limiting, call it the complexity of a situation, you also shape your future response to a real world situation. So it's not so much a warning against war games. It's more of try to think about the balance. This might be the cycle that Peter talked about earlier, the cycle of analysis and wargaming and reading, and particularly in an educational setting, wargaming always comes at the expense of something else. So how much do you do of it, and how much do you do of other things? What is the balance? How do you shape the total understanding of the future officer? That's the point of that part of the article.
Perfect. So I have one general question for everyone around the table before we jump into some of the great questions that our audience has put into the chat. So going back to the top, Karsten, one of the questions I'm going to ask for all of you, the same question, is what are the questions and topics in the field of educational wargaming and military exercise that future research should really explore? This is such a fascinating question, since all of you offered fascinating and unique perspectives on educational wargaming. And what would you like to be done in the future, right? Advancing on your own work, on something else you read in this special issue, or something that you left out on the cutting room floor. So Karsten, I start with you. What are the questions or topics in the fields of educational wargaming and military exercises that future research should explore?
There are so many. Just picking one, then we could just continue from where Kjetil he stopped. I think that, so the way I understand your article, Kjetil, it is that the games we play shape the understanding of our students' image of war, image of their profession, image of or perception of the kind of skills they need to succeed in war, or at least survive in war. But so, and we have these objectives that we would like them to learn when we design games. But what do they learn in addition to that? So sort of understanding the broader learning process that happens when they play games, and some of them may not be intended from our side at all. And how are we to understand that? What sort of theory could help us get a better understanding of what is going on in the minds of our students when they play? And with that understanding, how can we then have more focused learning, or maybe not? But if we want to focus the learning, how could we design our games to go more in the direction where we would like the students to learn? I'll just stop here. I have many other research questions, but I'll stop with this one.
So we'll move on to Peter. Peter, what is a topic or question that you would like to have expanded upon in the next issue or next special issue of another journal?
Well, all of these articles are full of great ideas that need to be incorporated by those of us working in the field to make better use of the tools that we're trying to create. But it strikes me that if professional military education is going to improve, then we need to more effectively integrate wargaming into the process. Well, how can that happen? Okay, you can't just wave your hands and make it so, right? And based on historical experience, particularly, I always go back to the U.S. Naval War College between the wars. And that use of gaming was a combination of top-down and bottom-up. If you look at the Prussian Free Kriegspiel, which evolved when there were experienced combat officers that were called on to communicate their experience through games. That was how the Prussian Kriegspiel evolved. Well, the problem with the Free Kriegspiel, which is partly seen in the Matrix game as it's being done today, is that it sometimes divorces itself too much from broadly based, rigorous analysis in favor of personal anecdote. Both of those things have a role to play in professional military education. And we have to explore the potential of gaming, as Kjetil pointed out, the similarity, the family resemblance of gaming to learning in other ways as well. How do we use gaming to help structure the learning as well as be a part of that learning? That was what the Naval War College did between the wars. The games were the foundation for the rest of the education process. The students would have to learn about their situations to participate in the games, and then they were called upon to write analytical results based on the games, as Varen talked about. So there's a lot going on there. But if we're going to help all of the military and the civilian leadership for that matter, we need to come to grips not only with combat, which is perhaps the most complex and time sensitive of operations, but also the politics and economics of the strategy, planning, programming, budgeting, execution processes that underlie the creation of our military potential. All of that is important. So in order to do a better job of education across that spectrum, we need to find a way to break down the resistance of those who think of denigrate wargaming, especially wargaming in professional military education. The comment, who I can't remember now who made it, about this, Anne-Marie, I think, the student wanting to go to the library because they had to do real learning, that needs to be broken down. We need to find a way to get people past that, to see that wargaming is a part of the process. It's not an extra add-on, it's integrated in that process. Well, how do you do that? Okay, if you look at the history of things like the development of the, what was it, proportional aiming in naval gunnery in the turn of the 19th and 20th century, where Admiral Sims managed to finally, as a younger captain, get the US Navy to change the way it did business. If you look at how revolutionary change can occur within organizations, it generally is successful when you have insiders in the system who have the vision of how the revolutionary change has to occur, but they have to have the cooperation and top cover by senior leaders with the political power and position to help force the system to make those changes. If we're going to be doing that for education and professional military education, then we need to find those leaders and form those partnerships. Unfortunately, those things are usually just serendipitous. So how can we help encourage that serendipity? How can we make a foundation for doing that? We've got new generations of leaders coming along who have a lot more experience with gaming as they grew up than the past. So what can we do? We academics and military students of wargaming, how can we help? And it seems to me like the best way we can do that is to build or find examples of excellence, tools and ammunition that they can use to make those arguments and integrate the programs successfully. Once we can build those or find them, we need to publicize them and get them as widely viewed as possible. That's the only way we can get things done, to help make people make right decisions, rightly applied in time. That's what it's all about. Off my soapbox.
As always, Peter, it's illuminating to hear you speak. And this is a tough act to follow, but Tom, what are some questions or topics in the field in terms of the field of educational wargaming and military exercises that future research should address? Tom, over to you. Tom, I think you are muted.
Yep, that's my fault. Yeah, I mean, I was extremely gratified that Peter was talking about anecdotes, because the military runs on anecdotes, because they're extremely helpful in putting the lessons we're trying to do into context. And a lot of wargaming is discovery learning. So, you know, when people take part in a wargame and they go, oh, what's the range of a certain weapon system? Because they have asked that question in the precise context where they need to know it, they remember. And it's extremely useful. But I don't think that's the example of the most important thing I think we ought to be doing in the future. I think we should be looking at failure, because there's far too many exercises, military training where we don't want to depress the students. We want to finish on a high so they always win. Which is absolutely desperately wrong message to send to people. You either win or you learn, and it's crazy. We can't expect people to learn lessons when a fabulous victory is assured. I had the great good fortune to do some work with Brigadier General Meir Finkel in the Israeli Dado Center for Interdisciplinary Studies. This is Dr. Meir Finkel. So he's got 3 PhDs and he's working on his 4th. So, oh my goodness. And one of his points was, if you're going to do a military exercise and the students don't fail at least half the time, then the problem isn't hard enough. You know, it's too easy for them, and they're not going to learn. And I think if we're going to look at all of those things, you do have, you know, how do you train an athlete to be a sprinter? You don't get him to walk down the road and then slap him on the back and tell him well done. You have to strain, you have to struggle, you have to go really hard. And I think teaching people how to deal with defeat and to learn from it, that point about switching between the immersion and then the analysis and the reflection, really well made. So yeah, that's what I would have. Make your exercises harder is my offering. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. You never disappoint. So our next person is Anne. So what are some topics or questions you would like to see in future research addressed?
I think what I've become more aware of through this writing this article and observing these matrix games that I based the article on, it's not too dissimilar from what Kjetil said earlier, actually. It's what do they actually learn from this? And learning occurs. So how do the we need to pay a bit of attention to the scenario, although I've heard other people present very convincing arguments otherwise here, and the pedagogical and taxonomic work that these narratives do. By that I mean how they frame and construct the reality that we ask the students to accept and respond to, and how it within the game enables certain responses and disables others. And it seems to me that this could impact on how how the students understand key aspects of professional practice and the concept of military professionalism itself. So ideally, I would see us moving to studying war games with half an eye on the scenario and half an eye on how it's played as well, to see the two halves better interconnected, the game scenario and the playing of the game.
Fantastic. So our next question goes to Howard. Same question. What are some topics or questions you would like to see addressed in future research?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's research or collecting best practices, and I also come from the angle of analysis more than education, so that might influence my answer. But I still think there's a lot to do when it comes to how can you trust the results from any individual game you run? How can you trust the learning you have from any individual game you have conducted? As I mentioned, I come from more an analytical background, and I want to use the results from games in analysis to, well, support high-level decisions on national security, defense procurements, or whatever. And then we run games to help us get the data we need. And of course, I know the caveats with wargaming. It's often qualitative more than quantitative. It's one-shot results from any game. The results from one game is not necessarily valid for all decision contexts and so forth. But still, I know my operational analysis team, if they get a data point, they will use it. So it's so very, very tempting once you have some sort of empirical data or wargaming data to use it. And I also imagine this is a lesson relevant for learning and education. I mean, the things you take from one game is easily applied to real life context, and then you use that as learning that shapes your behavior in real life. So once again, how much trust can you put into the results from the games you run and the learning you get from them? That's one area I would like to look more into.
That's fantastic. And war game designers are notoriously bad about sharing their data from their games. So best of luck. Lauren, same question. What are some questions or topics in the field of educational wargaming and military exercises that you would like to be explored or future research applied?
Yes, so one thing I'm really interested in is the possibilities of advancing war games for something else, for political science, social science research as a research method. And so far, I'm trying to conduct sort of an alliance game where I use war games on the same level as I use interviews and survey research and field studies, both to see if I can find out something about the topic of alliances, but also as a bonus, if I can find out anything about using war games as a social science research on the same level with these other institutionalized and recognized qualitative methods. But I also have to say that I was inspired just now listening to all of you others. I was inspired to see some of the synergy effects here, because I was actually introduced without my knowledge to war games when I was a student, taking a course at the University of Oslo in political science of international negotiations, where my teacher, she engaged us in a whole day international negotiation. And I can honestly say that is the one thing I always come back to. And that is the one thing of my whole education that I really remember. And I've heard others say the same thing, that you actually remember what you wargame. Quite to the contrary of what is the case when you read, and what is the case when where you hear things from a teacher and so on. And so I think that is applicable to what Peter was talking about when it came to muscle memory, but also just memory. That war games are kind of unique when it comes to that ability to actually remember. You as a student, you get the ability to realize the course material, and you see the syllabus come to life, and that is something that you take with you. And Peter also mentioned the power of anecdotes, and I think that is what I'm really talking about when I am talking about making the war games into case studies. Which is actually just another way of saying an anecdote, something that you take with you, a story that you use as an example. both for yourself and for others.
So I will look forward to your future Alliance war game, because that'll be super fascinating. Please let us know if you ever make any progress on that. So next is Mas. Same question. What are some questions or topics in the fields of educational wargaming and military exercises that future research that you would like to see?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I think the pressure is to do more efficient education. So at least my experience as an educator is that I'm expected to produce the same education for less money. And if we are to do this, we need to make more efficient education, and it means we need to make more efficient exercises. And then we get the question, how do we reach our learning objectives, and how do we know that we reach our learning objectives? So what I would like to know is which elements of what I put into my exercises the students or cadets actually learn from, and what is there because I think it's nice, or because I believe it works, or whatever. And so when I was writing my article for this special issue, I started looking at how do people evaluate their cyber defense exercises, because I work with cyber defense exercises, and it seems that the main method is to ask the participant if they felt that they learned something. And that's about as informative as asking people, did you have a good time? And usually they have, so our exercises is a success. But I would really like to see research on how do we reach our learning goals, and how do we know that we learn, that we reach our learning goals. And perhaps the situation is better other places, but then I'm really eager to learn from them and apply it in my field.
Fantastic. Yeah. So one of the big questions around educational wargaming is how do we quantify or measure or prove that learning has happened between iterations of gaming and combination of other learning. So fantastic. Last but not least, Ken.
Thank you. Well, I'll pick up on the idea or the concept of anecdotes that Tom mentioned, and Vorden as well. Very often, I know that Tom said that military is run on anecdotes, and there's a positive spin on anecdote as a useful thing. Very often I find that anecdote takes the form of what I often call brother-in-law research, meaning that, well, my brother-in-law has been a smoker all his life and is fit as a youngster. So I think all the research on the hazards of smoking is bad, that sort of anecdote. I think that those kinds of anecdotes can arise from wargaming as well. You experience something in a wargame, and you take it as the truth that overrides whatever you've read about the subject. So what I'd like to know is what does it take for students to use the experiences from wargaming to discuss what they've read about in interesting ways. Very often well, the typical notion at our institution is that games and exercises are used to explore the ideas and the theory that you've read about to get a better understanding. But I think that is not as easy to pull off. You need to be at a certain level of, call it theoretical prowess, before you can discuss your experiences from war games in interesting ways. And I'd like to know, what does it take? I'm sure that a lot of you have experiences, excuse me, from that. I'd like to hear it, but that is something I'd like to explore at least.
Thanks for sharing. So we got through all of our pre-prepared questions. So one of the things I want to do is to address some of the fantastic and interesting questions that our audience provided. So one of the things I will toss out to specific members of our panel is a specific question. So first off, I would like to ask Peter first is, because he mentioned in his closing topics as well as like, how can we as practitioners, as both educators and also game designers, seek to overcome organizational and individual skepticism about implementing wargaming in PME?
Well, I think this is a case where you have to have examples of success. And there are historical examples. I keep going back to the U.S. Naval War College between the wars, but there are others as well. But the problem, of course, is that those examples are all past. And so it seems to me like what we need to do is we need to take a better, how shall I put it, a more thorough review of existing applications of wargaming in professional military education and get those more widely distributed. So I know that there are war games being done for educational purposes at Quantico and the Marine Corps. There are obviously war games still going on at the Naval War College. So I think that's our best way. Otherwise, the arguments that we've talked about here about what makes war games useful and valuable and how do you assess their value and the validity, those are all very important theoretical questions, but they're questions for academics like us to explore in detail based on our own experiences and our gathering of information. But getting those ideas into the heads of people who need to use them, that's the real key.
Yeah, fantastic. And for those who are interested in some educational wargaming that you can learn more about in the unclassified realm, you can look at War C, designed by Naval War College, which is used still at the Naval War College, but also at the U.S. Naval Academy. The games that Peter was mentioning was the operational war game system, along with a bunch of different commercial titles they use down at the Marine Corps University. And then there are other games here at Georgetown we have used that are both student design and also commercial or custom made by some of our designers. So there are lots of cool war games to look at and how they're being used in classrooms all across the world. Next question I actually want to ask is the same question to Howard. So Howard, you give some practical lessons on about planning and conducting war games. But one of the challenges that we have always seen is like skepticism among the faculty, among professors and so forth. So how can we get around that?
Well, my benefit is that I don't really work with education, so I could skip that question if I wanted to. But we also see skepticism when we do analytical games, of course. Getting people to attend the games just take several days to game out a future force structure. It's challenging to make people take the effort to do that. There might be other reasons as well, in that they come with already existing agendas to try to sell a solution in those games. But generally, we don't see too much of the skepticism when we run our games, because people can help shape the outcomes of the analysis or can help influence the analysis. That's a sort of a recurring issue as well for many of those attending our games, that they really want to take part because they can bring their experiences to the table. They can also bring their, well, sort of hidden agendas to the table. So it's more a question for us to try to manage those things afterwards, more than overcoming skepticisms in attending the games. So, yeah.
Thanks, Howard. Carson, do you have your hand up? You want to share something?
Sure. So something we've been talking about at the Military Academy is that we should be better to communicate with the operational branches, in our case, the armed forces, the Army. They are the ones who are receiving our cadets when they are finished with their education. So how do we design the games for them to make most sense in the Army? And how do we sort of carry them out in a way that makes sense? We can also talk about the umpire, the role of the umpire, and how do we evaluate the effect? Having a dialogue with the operational branches while we when we design the games, could also be a way to overcome the skepticism within our own academy among the military officers that war games are actually useful. So I think there's a win-win in many ways, integrating the operational branches into the design and implementation of war games. That was all. Thank you.
Thank you, Carsten. So our next question, I actually want to direct at Tom, because it's something that he mentioned was, I don't know whose Navy they're referring to because they didn't mention it, but it said, for the Chief of the Navy staff level, it seems like we have migrated to complex computerized wargaming and focus on validating our tactics and capabilities, which seems like an overreach of their usability. Would it be make more sense to use a matrix method with less tech foundation for these kind of games?
I would actually push back on that a little bit, in that there are big differences between fighting a war at sea and in the air on the land, and it's understanding that's particularly important. So quite recently we were doing a war game where we were designing stuff for air packages, and there are a number of occasions where it became obvious that, because of the combination of circumstances and the equipment choices, that there weren't enough weapon systems to be able to prosecute the target. So for the army guys, it's like, well, just, you know, fight a bit harder. And it's like, no, you don't understand. There's not enough weapon system to prosecute the target. So go home immediately, because any time that you don't, you're just going to waste valuable lives and you're not going to achieve anything. Now, it's the same for the Navy as it is for the Air Force, whereas the Army tend to think that if they're just a bit braver or they shoot a bit more accurately, they will be better off. There are points beyond which there is no point in carrying on, because you won't succeed. You will just get people killed. So I would push back a little bit in that if you're just using qualitative techniques in areas where you have a platform capability, where there is a pass-fail, then I don't think you'll be right. So, you know, there is a limit to some of these things. And while morale and what goes on in the hearts and minds of people is incredibly important, you can't just get away with grit and determination under all circumstances. Over.
Absolutely, thank you. So one of the other questions I want to address is, I think it was to Varen when her topic about switching modes and games is, I think this is from Stefan. So it says, in introducing wargaming to the Norwegian Naval Academy students, I've assigned groups of students as facilitators and umpires as well as blue and red teams. This has worked very well in tabletop war games. Do you have any ideas or experiences about students switching roles into umpires or moderators or facilitators in wargaming sessions?
Yes, so good question. So unfortunately, I haven't really had that much experience with designing tactical games where you have a clear winner and one decision is obviously the better one, and where you can really introduce an umpire to assess those decisions. But I have had an experience that is perhaps somewhat similar, and that in my wargame or a diplomatic simulation about an international negotiation, which is this year about to be conducted for the 4th time, I had some difficulty with how to mediate the game, because I had to I did want a UN player. I did want a negotiation where the UN was the mediator for 5 countries and NATO. And I wondered whether this UN player should be played by a student, but I saw, and that would be the most realistic game, but I tested the game and it ended up being so boring. Nothing happened because this UN player was so effective. she managed to just keep the calm, and nothing really ever transpired between the players. And so I ended up having the professor of the course as the UN mediator, and he was just totally unrealistic as a mediator because he was constantly triggering conflict. But that was his role. He was supposed to put his finger on every potential conflict, every potential nuance that he knew that the students would have to learn something about in order to get something valuable for the course out of this game. And so I had to constantly explain this to the students that he is supposed to be an unrealistic mediator, but it's because of the playability of the game. So this was a compromise. And he also then ended up acting as sort of an umpire because it was his voice that became the authoritative one. He was the one who led the discussion on what was realistic, what is the interpretation from this and that theory, and so on and so on. So that was an interesting experience that I've kept him as the sort of umpire, but the mediator all of these years, because I see that is the way the students gain most.
Fantastic. So that wraps up most of our questions today. So first off, I would like to thank all of our panelists and all the different authors of this special issue for spending their evening/afternoon with us here at the Georgetown University Wargaming Society to share insights of not only wargaming and their papers, but also some of their wider insights. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Next thing I will say is that if you are interested in other wargaming content, all of our webinars from our past 2 years of existence here at the Georgetown University Wargaming Society is on our YouTube page. Feel free to find us on YouTube and go through a lot of our great, fantastic content, which includes a recent presentation by the Norwegian Naval Academy on how they use naval wargaming up there back in August. One last plug before we end our session today is that Connections conference online is doing a special showcase on, I believe, the 19th, that is looking predominantly all at game designs and case studies of how designers approach specific problems and how and why they designed their games the way they did. Some of them, and a good chunk of them, being educational or commercial. So if you're interested, go find it. I'll try to post a link of it in the chat. And for those watching this later on, you can just Google it, and it's called the Connections Wargaming Showcase. It can also be found on the Armchair Dragoons website if you look for it. So thank you all again, and I appreciate it, and have a good evening.